The morning sun of Centauri Prime stretched long shadows across the vast amphitheatre of the Galactic Military Academy. Standing at its centre, Professor Keth'val faced 5,000 of the galaxy's finest soldiers. His 6 arms moved in flawless harmony, each gesture timed with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony of war, highlighting the glowing holographic displays behind him. "Welcome, warriors of the galaxy," Keth'val declared, his voice resonating effortlessly across the immense hall without the aid of amplification. His scaled, reptilian face curled into what his species considered a smile, rows of razor-sharp teeth glinting under the sun, evolved for tearing flesh and commanding fear. Today, we begin our exploration of advanced tactical warfare, an in-depth study of the greatest military strategists our civilizations have ever produced. Across the auditorium, soldiers representing 47 distinct species listened in focused silence, towering Krillian berserkers with bone-armored skulls, elegant Athatharan telepaths capable of crushing minds from orbit, hyper-intelligent synthoids whose neural matrices rivaled the computing power of entire planetary networks, warriors, legends, weapons of living history, each forged in the fires of conquest and hardened by victory. "And now," Keth'val continued, a flicker of amusement dancing in his voice, "before we delve into the true masters of war, we must acknowledge the galaxy's most enduring farce." He paused, letting the silence stretch into anticipation. The humans. A ripple of laughter swept through the amphitheatre. The Krillians' bone plates rattled with their chuckling, while the Athitherans' mental amusement created a pleasant humming in the air. Even the normally stoic synthids emitted their version of laughter, a series of calculated beeps and clicks. "Oh yes," Keth'val said. 4 of his arms spread wide, while the other 2 manipulated the holographic display to show images of human soldiers. The soft-skinned bipeds who somehow convince themselves they belong among the stars. Look at them. No natural armor, no enhanced senses, no telepathic abilities, and no redundant organ systems. They are quite literally Professor's arrogant lecture, the most pathetic excuse for sentient life the galaxy has ever produced. The laughter grew louder. A particularly massive Gorvak warrior, whose species could survive in the vacuum of space, slapped his knee so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot. "Professor," he called out, his voice like grinding stone, "surely you jest. Even the glimmerworms of Proxima 7 have better survival instincts than humans." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, Sergeant Chromax," Keth'val replied, his eyes glinting with malicious delight. "The glimmerworms at least have the decency to die quickly when threatened. Humans, on the other hand, seem to specialize in prolonging their suffering for everyone's entertainment." More laughter erupted from the crowd. The professor was clearly enjoying himself, his 6 arms now moving in an elaborate dance as he continued his lecture. "Consider their military history," he said, waving one arm dismissively. "They fight wars using projectile weapons that barely scratch modern armor. They rely on numbers rather than skill, throwing bodies at problems like some primitive hive mind. And their tactics. Oh, their tactics are the stuff of legend. They charge directly into superior firepower. They divide their forces when they should concentrate, and they consistently choose the most difficult path to victory when simple solutions exist." In the back row of the amphitheatre, largely ignored by the rest of the class, sat a single human. Captain Maya Fletcher wore the standard academy uniform. Her brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She neither laughed at the professor's jokes, nor showed any sign of offence at his words. Her grey eyes remained fixed on Keth'val, and she occasionally took notes on her datapad with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to document everything. "But here's the truly amusing part," Keth'val continued, warming to his subject. They actually believe they're warriors. They speak of honor and courage as if those concepts could somehow compensate for their obvious biological deficiencies. They've convinced themselves that their emotional volatility is somehow an advantage rather than a fatal flaw. A crystalline engineer whose silicon-based form sparkled in the auditorium's light raised what passed for a hand. "Professor, if humans are so incompetent, why are they allowed in the academy at all?" Keth'val's smile widened, showing even more teeth. "An excellent question, Cadet Quartzak. The answer is simple. Diversity requirements. The Galactic Council, in its infinite wisdom, decided that every species deserves representation in our military education system, even the hopeless ones." He gestured grandly with all 6 arms. "Think of it as charitable work. We're providing vocational training for a species that will never amount to anything more than cannon fodder." The human in the back row made another note. Human military history mockery. On her datapad, her expression unchanged. She seemed to be the only being in the entire amphitheater who wasn't finding the professor's performance entertaining. "Now then," Keth'val said, rubbing his hands together with obvious glee, "let us examine some specific examples of human military incompetence. I've prepared several case studies that perfectly illustrate why these creatures should never be trusted with anything more dangerous than a butter knife." The holographic display shifted to show what appeared to be historical battle footage. Keth'val had clearly spent considerable time crafting his presentation, each image carefully selected to support his narrative of human weakness. "Behold," he announced, pointing dramatically at the display, "the great human conflict they call World War II. Here we see humans fighting other humans, which already demonstrates their inability to recognize friend from foe. But notice how they conduct this warfare. They build massive, slow-moving vehicles called tanks that can barely achieve the speed of a leisurely stroll. Compare this to our Krillian hover destroyers, which can circle the globe in minutes." Sergeant Cromax nodded approvingly, his massive frame shaking with laughter. "Professor, those human machines look like they were designed by children playing with building blocks." "Precisely," Keth'val exclaimed. "And observe their aerial tactics. They strap themselves into primitive flying machines that require constant maintenance, burn fossil fuels, and can barely reach supersonic speeds. Meanwhile, our Earththeran pilots achieve faster-than-light travel through pure mental projection. The comparison is almost insulting to our intelligence." The Earththeran cadets in the audience hummed with pride, their translucent forms shimmering with satisfaction. One of them, a particularly graceful specimen named Valara, raised her hand. "Professor, surely their ground tactics show more promise." Keth'val's reptilian features twisted into an expression of mock sympathy. "Oh, my dear Valara, if only that were true. Watch this." The display showed human soldiers advancing across a battlefield. They move in straight lines. They expose themselves to enemy fire. They rely on primitive communication devices that can be intercepted by any first-ear signals cadet. It's almost painful to watch. A wave of incredulous laughter swept through the amphitheater. The synthoids calculated the tactical errors in real time, their digital displays showing probability matrices that confirmed the professor's assessment. The Gorvak warriors shook their heads in disbelief, while the Zahirian scouts, masters of stealth and infiltration, looked genuinely confused by the human approaches to warfare. "But here's my absolute favorite," Keth'val continued, his voice rising with enthusiasm. "Their naval strategies. They build floating cities called aircraft carriers and sail them slowly across vast oceans, making them perfect targets for any competent enemy. Compare this to our abyssal collectives, underwater cities that can relocate instantly through dimensional rifts." The laughter was becoming almost deafening now. Even some of the more serious military species were beginning to join in the mockery. The professor was clearly in his element, feeding off the crowd's energy. Throughout all of this, Maya Fletcher continued taking notes. Her pen moved steadily across her datapad, recording every word with mechanical precision. If the increasingly vicious attacks on her species bothered her, she showed no sign of it. Her posture remained perfectly straight, her breathing steady, her grey eyes focused and alert. Keth'val noticed her lack of reaction and felt a flicker of irritation. He had been expecting some response by now, some sign that his words were having an effect. The complete absence of emotion from the human was somehow more insulting than if she had broken down crying or stormed out in anger. Maya Fletcher. Introduction. "Of course," he said, his voice taking on a more pointed tone. "We shouldn't be too hard on the humans. After all, they're working with significant biological limitations. Their fragile bones break under stress that wouldn't even register to most of us. Their soft skin tears at the slightest provocation. They require constant feeding and watering like domestic pets." A few of the students shifted uncomfortably. The Athetherans, despite their amusement at the tactical discussion, were beginning to sense that the professor was crossing a line. Their natural empathy made them sensitive to cruelty, and this was starting to feel less like education and more like bullying. They also have this adorable habit of forming emotional attachments to their weapons and equipment, Keth'val continued, his tone dripping with condescension. They give names to their machines, talk to them like living beings, and actually mourn when they're destroyed. It's quite touching, really, in the way that watching a child cry over a broken toy can be touching. Maya's pen paused for just a moment. It was such a subtle movement that only the most observant would have noticed it. But then she resumed writing, her expression unchanged. From his position at the front of the amphitheatre, Keth'val could see the faint lines of old scars on her hands, visible when she moved her pen. There was something about the way she sat, too. A readiness that seemed at odds with her apparent passivity. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her boots polished to a mirror shine, and despite her small size compared to the other species in the room, she somehow managed to project an aura of competence that was almost unsettling. "But perhaps," Keth'val said, his voice becoming more aggressive as he focused his attention on the silent human, "we should hear from an expert on human military capabilities. Captain Fletcher, isn't it? Would you care to defend your species' reputation?" 5,000 pairs of eyes turned to look at Maya. The amphitheatre fell silent for the first time since the lecture began. The tension was suddenly thick enough to cut with a blade. Maya looked up from her notes, met Keth'val's gaze with calm grey eyes, and simply said, "I'm here to learn, Professor. Please continue." The simplicity of her response somehow made it more powerful than any angry outburst would have been. Keth'val's 6 arms twitched with frustration. The challenge issued. The human's calm response had deflated what should have been a moment of triumph, and he could feel the momentum of his lecture slipping away. The other students were watching him now, waiting to see how he would handle this unexpected development. "Oh, how very diplomatic," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'm afraid passive learning isn't enough for a military academy. Captain Fletcher, we deal in practical applications here, not theoretical niceties." Maya nodded once, her pen poised over her datapad. "I understand, Professor." "Do you?" Keth'val's reptilian features twisted into what he hoped was an intimidating expression. "Because I'm beginning to think that your species' legendary cowardice extends to intellectual discourse as well as physical combat." A few gasps echoed through the amphitheatre. Even by the standards of military training, this was unusually harsh. The Athetherans were now actively uncomfortable. their forms flickering with distress. Several synthoids were calculating the probability of this escalating into a disciplinary incident. Maya set down her pen and looked directly at the professor. "What would you like me to do, Professor?" Keth'val felt a surge of vindictive pleasure. Finally, he had pushed the human into a corner. If humans are truly capable warriors, as some misguided individuals claim, then prove it. Not with words, not with excuses, but with action. "What kind of action?" Maya asked, her tone remaining perfectly level. "A practical demonstration," Keth'val announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheater. "Our academy has the most advanced combat simulation systems in the galaxy. If you're so confident in human military capabilities, then demonstrate them." The crowd began to murmur with excitement. Combat demonstrations were always popular, especially when they involved the potential humiliation of an unpopular species. "What are the parameters?" Maya asked, as if she were discussing the weather. Keth'val's smile widened. The human was actually going to go through with this standard defensive scenario. "You'll be tasked with holding a strategic position against overwhelming odds. The simulation will provide you with limited resources and an increasing number of enemy forces. Most cadets last approximately 15 minutes before conceding defeat." "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll be forced to recommend that humans be permanently barred from advanced military courses," Keth'val said, savouring each word. "After all, if they won't even attempt to prove their competence, how can we justify wasting combat arena setup, resources on their education?" The murmur in the crowd grew louder. This was no longer just a lecture. It was about to become a spectacle. Maya stood up, gathering her notes with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the lecture. "1 hour is sufficient," she said. As she walked toward the exit, Keth'val called after her. "Oh, and Captain Fletcher, don't feel obligated to drag this out for the sake of entertainment. When you realize you're beaten, just surrender. No one will think less of you for acknowledging reality." Maya paused at the door and turned back. "Thank you for the advice, Professor." And then she was gone, leaving behind an amphitheater buzzing with anticipation and a professor who was already mentally composing his victory speech. "Well then," Keth'val announced to the remaining students, "I suppose we have an hour to kill before we witness the final proof of human military incompetence. I suggest you all attend. Educational opportunities like this don't come along very often." The students began filing out, chattering excitedly about the upcoming demonstration. Word spread through the academy like wildfire. By the time the hour was up, it wouldn't just be the original 5,000 students in attendance. The entire academy would be there to witness what Keth'val was already thinking of as the definitive humiliation of the human species. He had never been more confident about anything in his life. The Advanced Combat Simulation Arena was a marvel of galactic engineering, a massive spherical chamber that could recreate any battlefield environment with perfect accuracy. As Keth'val entered the observation deck, he was pleased to see that his prediction had been correct. The entire academy had shown up. Nearly 15,000 beings packed the viewing areas, representing every species in the galaxy. The excitement was palpable, crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Everyone wanted to witness what they assumed would be the spectacular failure of the lone human. "Ladies and gentlemen," Keth'val announced into his microphone, his voice carrying throughout the arena, "welcome to what I believe will be the most educational demonstration in Academy history. Today, we will finally put to rest any lingering doubts about human military capabilities." The crowd roared with approval. Betting pools had already formed, with odds heavily favouring a human defeat within the first 10 minutes. some particularly simulation begins. Optimistic gamblers were even wagering on whether Maya would last 5 minutes. In the center of the arena, Maya stood perfectly still as the simulation environment materialized around her. The scenario was brutal but fair, a standard defensive position atop a rocky hill with limited cover and resources. She had been given a basic energy rifle, a small supply of ammunition, some portable barrier generators, and a few medical supplies. "The objective is simple," Keth'val explained to the crowd. "Captain Fletcher must hold her position against waves of increasingly aggressive enemy forces. The simulation will begin with 50 opponents and add 50 more every 5 minutes until she either surrenders or is eliminated." Maya checked her equipment with methodical precision, her movements efficient and practiced. She examined the rifle, tested the barrier generators, and surveyed the terrain with the thoroughness of a professional soldier. To most observers, her actions seemed routine, almost boring. "Notice how she's wasting time with unnecessary equipment checks," Keth'val commented smugly. "A truly competent warrior would have already identified the optimal defensive positions and begun preparations. This is exactly the kind of inefficiency we've come to expect from humans." The simulation began with a soft chime, as the enemy soldiers, controlled by the Academy's most advanced artificial intelligence, materialized at the base of the hill. They were well armed, well coordinated, and programmed with the combined tactical knowledge of dozens of species. Maya's response was immediate, but seemingly conventional. She activated her barrier generators to create a defensive perimeter, took up position behind the largest piece of cover, and began engaging the advancing enemy forces with precise, measured shots. "Standard defensive tactics," Keth'val observed, his tone already victorious. "She's doing exactly what any first-year cadet would do. Watch how quickly the AI adapts to her predictable patterns." The enemy forces began their assault, advancing in coordinated waves while providing covering fire. Maya's position was soon under heavy bombardment, energy bolts sizzling past her head and scorching the rocks around her. She returned fire steadily, her shots finding their marks with admirable accuracy. "She's actually not terrible," admitted Sergeant Cromax, grudging respect creeping into his voice. "Her marksmanship is quite good." "What? Marksmanship means nothing against superior numbers and tactics," Keth'val replied dismissively. "Watch what happens when the AI starts using advanced flanking maneuvers." But as the battle progressed, some of the more observant members of the audience began to notice something odd. Maya wasn't just shooting at the enemy soldiers, she was shooting at specific parts of the terrain. Rocks, trees, even what appeared to be empty ground received her attention. "What is she doing?" muttered Valara, the Athatheran cadet. "She's wasting ammunition on random targets." The synthoids in the audience were running calculations, trying to determine the logic behind Maya's seemingly random shots. Their processors worked overtime, but they couldn't identify any pattern that made tactical sense. "Perhaps the stress is getting to her," suggested a Zahirian scout. "Humans are known for their emotional instability under pressure." Keth'val nodded approvingly. "Precisely what I expected. She's already beginning to crack under the pressure of real combat. Notice how her shot placement is becoming increasingly erratic." But Maya's expression remained calm and focused. She moved with deliberate purpose, shifting positions at seemingly random intervals, sometimes abandoning perfectly good cover, to relocate to what appeared to be inferior positions. Her resource management was equally puzzling. She seemed to be using her barrier generators in ways that the environmental tactics revealed manual clearly stated were suboptimal. 5 minutes elapsed, announced the simulation's computer voice. Enemy force increased to 100 units. The second wave of enemies appeared, doubling the pressure on Maya's position. The crowd leaned forward expectantly, certain that this would be the moment when human weakness finally revealed itself. Instead, Maya's tactics became even more unconventional. She began using her medical supplies in ways that made no apparent sense, applying them to inanimate objects rather than herself. She repositioned her barriers in configurations that seemed to offer less protection, not more. "This is painful to watch," Keth'val announced, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. 10 minutes elapsed, the computer announced. Enemy force increased to 150 units. The third wave materialized, and suddenly everything changed. The rocks that Maya had been shooting at began to crack and tumble, creating avalanches that crushed entire squads of advancing enemies. The trees she had targeted fell in precisely calculated directions, forming barriers that funneled the remaining forces into deadly kill zones. The empty ground she had shot revealed itself to be unstable terrain that collapsed under the weight of the enemy advance, swallowing dozens of soldiers in sinkholes. The arena fell silent, except for the sounds of simulated combat. "What in the seven hells?" breathed Sergeant Cromax, his massive frame leaning forward in disbelief. Maya had turned the entire battlefield into a weapon. Every seemingly random shot had been a calculated strike against the environment itself. She wasn't just defending a position. She was reshaping the terrain to her advantage in real time. But that was only the beginning. The medical supplies she had been applying to inanimate objects began to activate, releasing clouds of biochemical agents that interfered with the enemy AI's targeting systems. The barrier generators she had positioned in suboptimal locations suddenly revealed their true purpose as the enemy forces, channeled by the environmental changes, walked directly into overlapping fields of fire. "Impossible," whispered a Zetherian intelligence officer. "She's manipulating the AI's decision-making algorithms by controlling the battlefield topology." Maya moved through her transformed killing field like a ghost, appearing where the enemy least expected her, striking from angles that shouldn't have existed. She had somehow managed to create a three-dimensional maze out of what had started as simple terrain, and she knew every secret passage. The enemy forces, designed to adapt to conventional tactics, found themselves unable to process what was happening. Their programming expected rational defensive patterns, predictable human behavior, standard military doctrine. Instead, they faced something that defied their understanding of warfare entirely. "She's using psychological warfare against an artificial intelligence," one of the Cententoids observed, his digital voice filled with something resembling awe. "She's exploiting the fact that the AI was programmed to fight rational opponents." Keth'val's 6 arms hung limply at his sides as he watched his carefully constructed worldview crumble in real time. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Humans were supposed to be weak, predictable, easily defeated. They weren't supposed to turn the laws of physics into weapons. 15 minutes elapsed, the computer announced, its tone somehow less confident than before. Enemy force increased to 200 units. Maya didn't even seem to notice the announcement. She moved through the chaos with the calm efficiency of someone performing a routine training exercise. Her breathing remained steady, her movements precise, her expression almost bored. That was when the truth began to dawn on some of the more experienced observers. "Look at her stance," murmured General Vex Rix, a Krillian veteran with over 2 centuries of combat experience. "AI system breakdown. That's not academy training, that's field experience." "And those scars on her hands," added Commander Theo Vara, an Athetheran special operations officer. "Those aren't from training accidents." Maya's true nature was becoming apparent to those who knew what to look for. The way she moved wasn't the result of classroom instruction. It was muscle memory earned through actual combat. Her tactical innovations weren't the desperate improvisation of a cornered cadet. They were the refined techniques of a professional warrior who had faced real enemies and lived to tell about it. 20 minutes elapsed. Enemy force increased to 250 units. The simulation was now throwing forces at Maya that would challenge an entire squad of elite soldiers. The AI had begun to adapt, learning from its previous failures and adjusting its tactics accordingly. It started using more sophisticated approaches, coordinated attacks, even attempting to predict and counter Maya's environmental manipulations. Maya adapted faster. When the AI learned to avoid her terrain traps, she created new ones. When it adjusted its formation to minimize casualties from environmental hazards, she changed the environment again. When it tried to overwhelm her with sheer numbers, she turned the enemy forces against each other by manipulating their movement patterns. She's not just fighting the simulation, realized Dr. Mortax, the Academy's Chief of Tactical Studies. She's fighting the programmers who created it. She's identifying the underlying assumptions in the AI's design and exploiting them. The crowd had gone from expecting entertainment to experiencing something approaching religious awe. They were witnessing a masterclass in warfare from a species they had dismissed as irrelevant. Keth'val felt sick. His reputation, his career, his entire sense of superiority was evaporating before his eyes. Every joke he had made, every dismissive comment, every arrogant assumption was being thrown back at him by the small human who was systematically dismantling the most advanced combat simulation in the galaxy. 25 minutes elapsed. Enemy force increased to 300 units. Maya glanced at her chronometer and made what appeared to be a minor adjustment to her position. The movement seemed insignificant, but within seconds it had triggered a cascade of environmental changes that resulted in the complete annihilation of an entire enemy platoon. She was no longer just winning. She was demonstrating that the very concept of overwhelming odds was meaningless when applied to human warfare. The arena had become a laboratory, and Maya was the scientist conducting an experiment in applied lethality. The hypothesis was simple. Could one human, properly motivated and tactically creative, defeat any number of conventional opponents? The results were becoming increasingly clear, and Maya still looked bored. 30 minutes elapsed. Enemy force increased to 350 units. By now, the simulation had escalated far beyond its normal parameters. The AI was throwing everything it had at Maya, deploying tactics that would have overwhelmed entire battalions of conventional forces, aerial units, heavy armor, coordinated artillery strikes, electronic warfare specialists, even experimental weapons that existed only in theoretical databases. Maya's background revealed. Maya responded by doing something that no military theorist in galactic history had ever considered. She began teaching the environment to fight back. Using techniques that seemed to blend physics, psychology, and pure creative madness, she turned every element of the battlefield into an active participant in the combat. Rocks became projectiles with precisely calculated trajectories. Water sources became chemical weapons through controlled contamination. Even the air itself became hostile to her enemies as she manipulated atmospheric pressure to create localized weather phenomena. "She's not just adapting to the battlefield," whispered Dr. Mortax, his voice filled with something approaching terror. "She's making the battlefield adapt to her." The enemy forces found themselves fighting not just Maya, but the very ground beneath their feet, the air they breathed, and the laws of physics themselves. Every step they took led them deeper into a web of destruction that had no beginning and no end. 40 minutes elapsed. Enemy force increased to 400 units. The announcement was met with absolute silence. 15,000 of the galaxy's most elite warriors sat in stunned disbelief as a single human systematically dismantled forces that should have been impossible for anyone to defeat. Keth'val's reptilian features had gone pale, his 6 arms trembling as he gripped the observation rail. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for water. Everything he had ever believed about military hierarchy, species superiority, and the natural order of the galaxy was crashing down around him. "This is not possible," he whispered, but his words carried in the absolute silence of the arena. The simulation must be malfunctioning. The AI must have been compromised. General Vex Rix turned to look at him with contempt. "The only thing that's been compromised here is your understanding of warfare, Professor." Maya, seemingly oblivious to the psychological carnage she was inflicting on the audience, continued her methodical destruction of the enemy forces. By now, she had created what could only be described as a self-sustaining ecosystem of death. Every enemy unit that entered her territory triggered cascading effects that eliminated dozens of others. 45 minutes elapsed. Enemy force increased to 450 units. The AI had clearly reached the limits of its programming. It was no longer following conventional tactical doctrine, but was instead throwing random combinations of units at Maya in increasingly desperate attempts to find something, anything, that might work against her impossible defenses. Professor's complete defeat. Nothing worked. Maya glanced at her chronometer again and seemed to reach some internal decision. She walked calmly to the center of her transformed battlefield and activated her communication system. "Computer, end simulation," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the arena speakers. "Simulation cannot be terminated while enemy forces remain active," the AI responded. "Then deactivate all enemy forces," Maya replied, as if she were making a simple request. "That function is not available to simulation participants." Maya smiled for the first time since the demonstration had begun. It was not a pleasant expression. "Computer, analyze current tactical situation and provide probability assessment for enemy victory." There was a long pause. "Probability of enemy victory, 0%. All enemy forces have been neutralized or rendered combat ineffective." The arena erupted, not with cheers or applause, but with the sound of 15,000 beings suddenly remembering how to breathe. Maya deactivated her weapon and began walking toward the exit. As she passed the observation deck, she looked up at Keth'val with those calm grey eyes. "Professor," she said, her voice conversational, "you asked about my background earlier. I served 12 years with Human Special Operations Command. My specialty was asymmetric warfare against technologically superior opponents." She paused, considering her words carefully. "This simulation was designed for conventional forces using conventional tactics. I was holding back considerably to avoid damaging the Academy's equipment." The implications of her words hit the audience like a physical blow. She had been holding back. The impossible demonstration they had just witnessed was Maya fighting at a fraction of her actual capability. "You see," Maya Final Galaxy realization continued, her tone becoming almost educational. "Humans don't fight the way other species do. We don't have superior technology or enhanced physical capabilities. What we have is something far more dangerous, the ability to look at any situation and ask, what if we tried something completely insane?" Keth'val made a small, broken sound in the back of his throat. The galaxy's militaries spend centuries perfecting their doctrines, creating predictable patterns that can be studied and countered, Maya said. "Humans perfect the art of being unpredictable. We don't just think outside the box." "Professor, we turn the box inside out, set it on fire, and use the ashes to build something completely different." She turned to address the entire arena. "You've spent so much time assuming we were weak that you never stopped to ask why a species with no natural advantages managed to survive long enough to reach the stars. The answer is simple. We're very, very good at killing things that underestimate us." The silence that followed was deafening. Maya nodded politely to the crowd and walked out of the arena, leaving behind 15,000 of Outro and Subscribe, the galaxy's most elite warriors, and one completely broken professor who would never again make the mistake of underestimating the species he had once dismissed as a galactic milk.